Welcome fellows to Quiz Kids today. Before starting, please subscribe to our channel for more exciting quizzes. Are you smart enough to guess the 50 U.S. states by their regional flags? Guess the U.S. state. Alabama. Guess the U.S. state. Montana. Guess the U.S. state. Louisiana. Guess the U.S. state. Alaska. Guess the U.S. state. Nebraska. Guess the U.S. state. Maine. Guess the U.S. state. Arizona. Guess the U.S. state. Nevada. Guess the U.S. state. Maryland. Guess the U.S. state. Arkansas. Guess the U.S. state. New Hampshire. Guess the U.S. state. Massachusetts. Guess the U.S. state. California. Guess the U.S. state. New Jersey. Guess the U.S. state. Michigan. Guess the U.S. state. Colorado. Guess the U.S. state. New Mexico. Guess the U.S. state. Minnesota. Guess the U.S. state. Connecticut. Guess the U.S. state. New York. Guess the U.S. state. Mississippi. Guess the U.S. state. Delaware. Guess the U.S. state. North Carolina. Guess the U.S. state. Missouri. Guess the U.S. state. Florida. Guess the U.S. state. North Dakota. Guess the U.S. state. Texas. Guess the U.S. state. Georgia. Guess the U.S. state. Ohio. Guess the U.S. state. Utah. Guess the U.S. state. Hawaii. Guess the U.S. state. Oklahoma. Guess the U.S. state. Vermont. Guess the U.S. state. Idaho. Guess the U.S. state. Oregon. Guess the U.S. state. Virginia. Guess the U.S. state. Illinois. Guess the U.S. state. Pennsylvania. Guess the U.S. state. Washington. Guess the U.S. state. Indiana. Guess the U.S. state. Rhode Island. Guess the U.S. state. West Virginia. Guess the U.S. state. Iowa. Guess the U.S. state. South Carolina. Guess the U.S. state. Wisconsin. Guess the U.S. state. Kansas. Guess the U.S. state. South Dakota. Guess the U.S. state. Wyoming. Guess the U.S. state. Kentucky. Guess the U.S. state. Tennessee.